Okay, everybody, thank you for coming back to the Xanadu Review. As always, I'm your host, Presser John Anders, but you can just call me PJ. Well, today with me, I have a writer. She goes by the name of Jamie Brooks. She's a musician, a writer, and she writes The Seed of Loss here on Substack. So, Jamie, thank you so much for coming on the show. I'll let you introduce yourself to the audience and maybe go into a little bit more detail on your whole thing, your beat.
Sure. Yeah, I'm Jamie Brooks. I'm happy to be here. I spent the 2010s doing music under a few different monikers and also writing about it intermittently. And in recent years, I have been focusing more on the writing stuff. It's a very kind of transformational and chaotic moment for media and culture and music. And I have really found that my plate is very full, trying to understand and can synthesize ideas about all of the stuff that is happening.
Well, I think for what it's worth, from just kind of a nobody like me, I think you do a really good job at it, and I think you have a very interesting voice and perspective when it comes to writing about music. So that's kind of what made me want to invite you on the show, because I came across one of your articles. If I can, you were talking about. I'm trying to find the exact name of the article, but essentially, you were kind of going over the whole debacle that happened. I guess it was about a month ago, where Billy Corgan, famous, somebody who likes to be quiet and doesn't make a lot of trouble or controversy in the music industry, Billy Corgan decided to say that rock music was purposely pushed down in the culture, possibly CIA related, and that was kind of a slop mill thing. That kind of made the rounds in like the whole social media Substack world. I myself dipped my toe in just a wee little bit. But I thought you had a really interesting and thoughtful response. And I wanted to know if you wanted to talk about that article a little bit, just the topic more broadly too, because I think it's a really interesting jumping off point, because you talked about the degree to which the musical and media landscape is changing so rapidly. And I think that's a really good jumping in point for the conversation.
Yeah, because the period of time that he's talking about, that he's particularly personally fixated on, the late 90s, that was also a very transformational moment. That's one of the big shifts that, that I've certainly lived through. Yeah, I've always kind of admired how he's always kind of been on the ball relative to other musicians when it comes to the internet and when it comes to shifts in technology. Like, I'm going to say he's wrong. Like in the article, like I definitely did say he was wrong a bunch, but I do want to give credit where credit is due. He was on the internet very early. He was very savvy about stuff. He's very savvy about stuff right now. And I think like the slop mill success of that podcast, it's, that little bit about him saying that rock was dialed down in the culture by the CIA, that came out of his podcast that he posts on YouTube that he organized himself. So he's still kind of on it. He's still kind of, figured out the contours of the current landscape and is making content that is being successful. Even just over the past week, he made some comment about Sonic Youth, like being rich kids that didn't ever write choruses because they didn't have sufficient financial incentive to make them like really know how to work or something like that. Mm-hmm. And that had the whole timeline like just like completely breaking down for days. So he's he's
an interesting guy. And cards on the table, like Smashing Pumpkins is probably like one of my top favorite bands of all time. But as much as I'd love to have Billy on the show, I don't think he's going to do it. So I think I can say that he's a little sensitive. He is still so mad about the Pavement diss 30 years later, and I see why. But like you said, he's I don't think it's a coincidence that he transitioned to like working in the world of pro wrestling in his post music career.
Oh yeah, and I mean, pro wrestling is like the secret substrate of all American pop culture, like it is to America what the theater is to Britain.
Yeah.
he's a very savvy guy. He's done a lot of interesting things. I have certainly loved a lot of music that he's done. I haven't really checked out the more recent stuff.
Mhm.
His savviness has not managed to successfully get me to go that far in. But yeah,
Mhm.
so but you're absolutely right. He's very sensitive about what happened in the '90s when he sort of fell out of favor and got replaced in the firmament by rap metal band Sublime, and then eventually, the Max Martin Y2K teen pop wave. And I think he really personalizes the what happened to rock music writ large, and he tries too hard, or he feels too compelled to connect what happened to him personally to what happened to the genre overall. And I think that that's kind of like the main flaw in his analysis, because what happened to the Smashing Pumpkins is, I think, pretty different from what happened to rock music overall as a genre. Like, he says that the late '90s is when rock starts getting dialed down to make room for hip hop. And I think that, like, if you look at the sales, like, like hip hop really starts to become a big thing in the mainstream in the aughts. Like, obviously in the late '90s we have the whole bad boy wave, but the stuff that happened from Nelly's Hot and Her on, numbers wise, it was an order of magnitude bigger than even the bad boy stuff was. Like, when the Smashing Pumpkins fell off, there was still all kinds of stuff in rock that was huge at that point in time. It was just stuff like Limp Bizkit and Korn, and like, it was sort of a weird period where it was almost like heavier and more metal and more aggressive than what the Smashing Pumpkins was. Like, he was personally kind of like out of step with the prevailing trends, like, personally. And I think, like, he kind of wants to make it seem like he's a standard bearer for the genre writ large, and I don't know that he is. I think he's a more singular figure than that. And certainly the Smashing Pumpkins are a very singular band, which I think is like part of the reason why the Zoomers have kind of rediscovered them, because they were really doing their own thing.
Mhm.
Like, you can get into that catalog without having to care about what else was going on at the time. And I don't know if you can necessarily say the same thing about, like, I don't know, like Pearl Jam or something like that. I think that the impact that stuff had was more about, like, the moment in time than with the Smashing Pumpkins.
Sure. And there's a lot of interesting stuff there, and I would agree. And I think that's maybe part of the reason Smashing Pumpkins are a band that I enjoy so much, since I think there's like a million and one, Pearl Jam or Nirvana ripoffs, but kind of only Smashing Pumpkins sounds like Smashing Pumpkins. Um, and not to make it too much about Billy Corgan and the Smashing Pumpkins, because I do want this to be about a larger point. But I think you're kind of right. I think you hit the nail on the head, just as far as him having trying to make himself the standard bearer. Since I noticed that, since, like I said, that's one of my favorite bands, and I was a kid during the height of their whole heyday. And I only got into them, like, in the mid 2000s, when I got in, when I was in high school and I first started listening to music. But this was also the the early days of YouTube. I would watch all these old interviews, and he was somebody who, like, was so mad at other bands, hated being called grunge, hated being compared to any of these people. And now he's like, Kurt Cobain was a once in a generation talent. And he I think it feels very cynical to a certain degree, the way that he's positioning himself, and which, again, made a personal hero to me musically, as well as as a media figure, because as talented as he is musically, zero charisma, and he's been able to, like, make it in the world of pop culture, just through, like, I think, being very savvy.
Yeah, and so, like, it begs the question, like, if he's kind of, maybe in his head too much about it, and it wasn't the CIA or MTV that killed rock music, what did? And that's, like, another thing that I often like to write about, is that it was technology and the economic shifts that technology kind of enabled. Another big shift of this type that I like to call back to as an example is the shift that we saw in the 50s, where before that, live music was about large dance bands. You needed a lot of musicians on stage in order to fill up a big ballroom and create the kind of overwhelming sensory experience that we expect from live music, or that we want from it. But when electric amplification happens, then suddenly you can have like a rock and roll combo that can make the same amount of noise with a fraction of the people. And so even though people still like the sound of these big bands, a lot of people still hire them for their weddings, like when, they've decided budget isn't an issue and they just want to hear their favorite songs in the best possible way, they still often opt for the big band. But economically, and like the music industry, it's often perceived from the outside as this very kind of radical, like left liberal kind of space. But in terms of the economic incentives that drive everybody's actions, and I think Billy Corgan personally seems to understand this better than most, they're all small business owners. They have small business owner brain and small business owner incentives. So it's like, when you can do something faster and cheaper by using the new technology, like you're not going to stick to the old technology. You're just going to disadvantage yourself in the marketplace. And American music, especially, where we don't have the government arts funding or the public service media monopolies that middle power countries like Australia or the UK have. You can't disadvantage yourself in the market and expect to succeed. You got to do what is economically viable. So people started doing smaller bands that were amplified. People switched over to that sound. And, I remember reading like a great anecdote once about, Paul Simon's dad was the leader of one of these big dance bands. And at the moment, kind of at the end of the 50s and the beginning of the 60s, Paul Simon used to go on stage with his dad with an electric guitar to play like the twist, like during the period of time where the twist was becoming the new big thing. Just like, like where it's this rare transitional moment of overlap where you've got like the old paradigm and the new paradigm on stage at the same time. And so it happened very quickly, and pretty soon you didn't see big dance bands anymore. And the whole kind of paradigm of during the era of dance bands, the flagship product of the music industry was sheet music as opposed to records. So the shift towards electrification and the shift away from sheet music towards passive listening of records, it happened around the same time. It happened very quickly, and nothing was ever the same again afterwards. Like everybody moved over from the old thing to the new thing. And so around the year 2000, what happened was there was a shift from recording studios, like specialized analog gear and the way that records used to get made, which, required a lot of specialized knowledge and a lot of different people, a lot of different kinds of cooks in the kitchen, to computers, to using digital audio workstations, like on consumer grade machines. I can see in the background that you've got, like a guitar and a keyboard set up in your computer room. So, exactly what I'm talking about.
I've got a little recording setup. I have some microphones and other stuff out of the shot.
Yeah. And I mean, that's the one of my favorite movies, That Thing You Do from the 90s. It's like, Tom Hanks directed it. It's about a one-hit wonder band in the, early 60s, I think. And something that I think of often about that movie is it's like there's this band in a small town in Pennsylvania, and they lose their drummer, and in order to get a new one, they have to recruit this guy who is like a jazz guy, like who wanted to play jazz. Like he's like a holdover from that era, which is what was happening like just before rock music started to take off. And so like, the rock era of like the 50s and 60s was like constructed out of stuff that was like lying around, like expertise, people, like equipment that was lying around from the jazz era. And like it's almost like podcasts are sort of like constructed out of the wreckage of the aughts, like like after like the recordings started becoming totally devalued in the streaming era, like like everybody just started using that equipment to make podcasts. But in any case, yeah, the after the year 2000 or so, like "Live in La Vida Loca" by Ricky Martin was the first ever like Billboard #1 to be mixed entirely in the box on a laptop. That proved that like that type of record could work in the market. And so after everybody saw that, the record companies, the producers, everybody else, like after the economics like became real to them, you can make a #1 record like by doing it this way, and it's much faster, it's much cheaper, it requires much less specialized knowledge. Everybody starts moving that direction, and we end up with like music becoming something that was less about bands and less about collaborations between like different types of musicians, and more about being driven by producers. And what a producer was, from that point on, was whoever was sitting at the computer.
Yeah, and also interesting enough, my last comment on the great sullen one himself, that I know Billy Corgan's father was like one of those transitionary like 50s 60s band guys. So it's interesting that you see that that continuity.
Yeah,
But
100%.
yeah, so but one thing I do want to, well, first, I guess this is kind of a framing question. I think you have a lot of really great, well-researched points, and I'm definitely really interested in the music industry. But it sounds like you're many orders of magnitude, can't speak today, more educated on the topic than me. But there is something I do slightly want to push back on. But I do, and I think you kind of touched on it and acknowledged it a little bit. I wonder if, because I think of like, the alt rock generation and rock in general as being kind of almost self-defeating sometimes. Because funny enough, before we started this interview, a little bit before, I was watching just like YouTube shorts. I think I saw it was like Elliott Smith, who I think was Elliott, or like one of those types of dudes who like,
Talk about
he's like,
self-defeating.
yeah, right. Well, specifically because he started playing, I guess "I'm Not a Big Elliott Smith" song was one of his more popular songs. He's like, "Oh, I'm sorry, I just can't play it. If you don't, really feel it, then what's the point of playing it?" And to a certain degree, I get that. But at the same time, I feel like rock can sometimes, a lot of the times, it can be a little, at least in that like critical darling sense, can be a little bit too up its own ass. Because and I'm sure we'll get to this later. I use this term for myself kind of cheekily. Like I'm kind of a rockist, really. I like a lot of rock and pop. But I do think like a lot of the, especially like the Elliott Brooks style, I'm sorry, not Elliott Brooks, Elliott Smith style stuff can be a little bit self-defeating, because I don't think I've ever heard a pop musician or a hip hop musician do that. Because I'm sure you saw, growing up, since it seems like you're a big music person, the classic like Behind the Music or the One Hit Wonder. Like, I don't think I've ever seen like a hip hop artist or a pop artist being like, "Man, I hate that I had this one hit wonder that I have to play. It's such bullshit. I'm a real artist." Like, I'm sure it exists, but they seem to be less in their own head. Maybe I'm just totally off base here, because I don't really, because I like a lot of rock and pop from like the 60s, 70s, 80s. I'm not super into a lot of the more modern stuff, which we'll get into. But I do wonder if, kind of like you said, that's a part of it, because it's so self-defeating. It was just partially more economical to just get like a pop star or a rapper who is A, just one person, B, they don't have these hangups, and it's not 3 to 5, 7 people who are going to have personalities and maybe break up. It's just a surer bet.
I think that what happened in the early 90s and kind of rippled through subsequent years for a bit before dissipating, that alternative rock breakout moment. I wrote this article called the Story of Rockism, that sort of like traces where that came from, like a little bit, like how it
really good article, by the way.
Thanks. Yeah, the like the underground self-defeating kind of ethos that you're talking about, like it percolated in the underground for like over 10 years, and the oppositional posture against the mainstream was, you know, like a really defining feature of it. Like, you know, like the Replacements refused to make a proper music video. Like they had so much of what Nirvana had. Like the Kurt Cobain's vocal style to me like really feels indebted to what Paul Westerberg was doing vocally, and they had like much more accessible kind of songs than a lot of their contemporaries like Black Flag or, you know, Husker Du or whoever. But like they just would not go all the way there. They would not like, you know, like write like the hit. They were really bad at translating their live energy to recordings properly, and they would not play ball in terms of promotion. Like they wouldn't make a proper music video at a time where MTV was absolutely ruling the school as far as curation goes. And, you know, they infamously went on SNL and they accidentally swore during one of the performances and got themselves banned. Like that self-defeating kind of quality, like that fixation on authenticity, which kind of goes part and parcel with the self-defeating attitude you're talking about. It's a really strange kind of thing, that is like, I think you see it in a lot of different places and in a lot of different parts of American pop culture, and that it penetrated the mainstream to the extent that it did is so weird. And if you look at like the overall arc of American popular music, it's like up until we have grunge, like people fixate on hair metal, but like, you know, some of the other stuff that was going on was, you know, rap and Miami bass and up-tempo dance music, like all this like everybody dance now, like CNC Music Factory type stuff. There was a lot going on like in 1991 that didn't really have anything to do with like the hair metal versus grunge like kind of dichotomy. And then like, you know, grunge is almost like this kind of like weird hiccup where like suddenly it just pops up and like, you know, has like this huge impact, and then it's like over time like we go back to the trajectory that we had been on. So it's like alternative rock is very strange. Like, you know, like when you zoom out, like it doesn't really fit the overall trajectory, which I think is like part of the reason why so many people are still so attached to it, because it kind of suggested like a different sort of world than the one we ended up living in. So it's kind of oftentimes like, you know, like when I point out things about the overall trajectory, you know, people who are very attached to the rock side of things are like, you know, I think that's why arguments about rockism and poptimism can be so contentious, is because like people who live through that moment, or people who really feel themselves like inside of the music from that moment, like they have a hard time seeing like what a blip it was.
Sure. Well, I mean, I want to put a pin in the you know, rockism versus poptimism thing, because I think there's some meat there. But I think it probably goes without saying that rockism versus poptimism is not really about the music per se. It's aesthetic preferences and whatnot. But to backtrack slightly, I think, well, first of all, I would say that, like, you know, I think you touched on in your article about rockism really well, about, well, first of all, that like Kurt Cobain and Nirvana, like they were willing to play ball in a way that these other bands weren't. You know, it seems very calculated now, because I know a lot of people really idolize Kurt Cobain. I don't, you know, I was, you know, pretty little kid when his whole thing was happening, so I don't have any strong attachment to it. But you can see when I've looked into it later that he was like, you know, very much putting on this like, oh, I don't want to have to, you know, do these interviews, but you're still doing the interview. I mean, also it doesn't help that he looks like a male model. Like if he looked like Buzz Osborne, I don't think they would have blew up like they did. But like, you know, I remember kind of similarly, like I think it was Bill Burr he really roasted Eddie Vedder for like this clip where like Eddie Vedder is getting interviewed. It's like, oh, I have to be interviewed. It's like, bro, you can leave if you want. Like, this is your job. Which to me personally, like, I find that whole thing a lot less endearing. You know, now it's like, you know, people aren't making money touring, all that kind of thing. It's like, I'm sorry that you have to like play hit songs that people love and get to travel the world. That must be really hard for you, man.
I'm curious how you feel about the you know, when artists complain about having to make content on social media.
Um, I I don't know. I hadn't really thought about it. Because I think it's maybe a little bit of a maybe slightly a bird of a different feather. I guess it depends on the era, right? Because I think if you are an artist of, we'll say, like the 80s or 90s, something like that, I feel like that's probably pretty far outside of your wheelhouse. But if you're from like the last 20 years, like I feel like that's part and parcel. Um,
Yeah,
I don't know, what do you think?
I would tend to agree. You know, like I'm Canadian originally, but I've spent most of my life in the States, and
Mhm.
so I feel like I've kind of internalized like you know, in Canada, like if I had stayed there, all of my peers and, you know, like I know lots of Canadian musicians, they get grants from the government to go on tour. They get grants from the government to make records. They get grants from the government to make music videos. So they get to kind of focus on the parts of the job that are creatively fulfilling to them to an extent that American musicians don't. And I identify, I guess, more with the American musicians where it's like, if you want to survive like in this country, like where you don't have any of that stuff, where the government is not going to help you, and you actually have to compete with all these other people from other countries that are all trying to get at the American audience because it's so big. Like you have to hustle, like you have to move, like you have to work. That's kind of like the approach that makes sense to me. So when people complain about the, you know, the content creation stuff, like I have a hard time even as a musician like being sympathetic about it. Like, you know, like yeah, you don't get to focus on the part of your job that is most creatively fulfilling. Like, do you think most people like that have jobs like get to do the part of it that they find most satisfying like all the time? Like, do you think like most people that work for a living, like, you know, that like to draw, like, you know,
Yeah,
get to draw all day? And you know, like Billy Corgan, like one of the reasons I kind of admire him is that, you know, like you would never hear him complaining about that. Like he does make content. He found a way to work
he's
to
been
make
ahead of the
content.
curve.
Yeah, and he's good at it. Like, you know, like people talk about the stuff that he posts. Like he's it's part of the art form.
He he beat Radiohead to digital releases because they famously did In Rainbows and Pay Your Own. He did that in like 2000, and then in the early 2010s, he had like an entire like he was doing like a social media campaign just on his own. Like, let me release a couple songs from this album, and it didn't really take off, but I admired that he was able to do it. But I
Yeah.
think that actually leads into something else that I wanted to talk to you about that you touched on. And it's the debate, like, as a larger point, like as music as a meritocracy versus music as something that's gate kept by um, record executives or the technology itself, or gate kept by critics. And personally, I think it's kind of a proprietary blend. Um, I think I don't know, I guess, do you want to clarify your position? Because I don't necessarily think it's 100% a meritocracy, or just like whatever sells the best. I think the record companies do put their hand on the scale to push certain things. And just as maybe as a framing question, I don't know. I'm sure you're aware of the whole Geese debacle, but the crux of it for the audience, if they don't know, there's this band Geese that people got mad at them for um, getting a depending on either like being an industry plant or getting a push from the record company, depending on how you're looking at it. And I'm interested to know your opinion since I didn't dig too deep into it since I never listened to them. But to me, like, rock fans will complain all day that rock is dead and not culturally relevant, and then totally freak out when they get at least from what my understanding, and maybe you know better and you can tell me, but from my understanding, getting a push from a record company in the era of digital music consumption. So I guess, what are your thoughts?
Well, as far as Geese goes, they are a band that last year they put out an album called "Getting Killed," and there was a lot of hype about it. Not just from critics, but like just from within institutions generally. Like I remember, you know, I was in the room while somebody was watching an interview with Jack Black, Jack White, Jack Black.
One of
He
them,
was,
one of the Jacks.
I think he was promoting like one of these movies, one of these video game adaptations that he's in or something. And somebody asked him like what he was listening to lately, and he was like, well, I don't want to sound like a cliche, but I'm really loving this new Geese record. You got to check this shit out. Like just people within the establishment, whatever you want to define the establishment as, like really seemed to be into this Geese band, and the critics were really loving it, and there was like a lot of hype around them, like people being like, oh, like a real band, like like doing it in a real way is like blowing up again, like like culture's coming back, like rock's coming back, like things are going to be good again. Like that was kind of the energy around the rollout of that album, and I found it like very confusing because unlike like a lot of people that criticize music as a vocation or regular pursuit, I like to look at the numbers. I like to understand what's actually popular. It doesn't bum me out. I don't feel like it turns me into a metrics brain stooge or something like that. Like I enjoy knowing about like what the shape of culture actually is, even if it's stuff that I'm not personally interested in. And what I found about Geese is that like, the numbers were not necessarily very good. The records did not necessarily sell that well. The main numerical thing about them that suggested that something was kind of going on is the resale value of tickets to their shows were like outrageous. There were people paying thousands of dollars to go see shows on their album tour in markets like LA and New York. Interestingly enough, other markets like Austin, Texas, like they were going for face value. So it's like this hype, this phenomenon that some people felt really caught up in. It was extremely localized to like a few areas of the United States and those places alone. So it was a very strange phenomenon where like inside certain bubbles they seemed like absolutely massive, and then outside of okay, well, we're back. Outside of those bubbles, like they didn't necessarily seem that big. Like there seemed to be like a real discrepancy between the the hype and the actual material basis for the hype. So recently, there's this reporter, Kristen Robinson over at Billboard. She really does a lot of great reporting. It's from a trade publication perspective, so it can be like a little bit like too kind of friendly to the record company perspective sometimes. But, like if you follow her stuff, you learn a lot of interesting things. She did an interview with a company called Chaotic Good Projects, which had been hired by Geese's label to do a specific kind of marketing for them that involved creating a bunch of fake accounts on social media to post about Geese and to use their songs in posts that were supposed to just look like regular social media posts. So what people kind of took issue with is, they felt like it was the hype around them was being astroturfed. It was people saw a distinction between this sort of marketing and regular marketing where you're just sort of like buying ads or like this type of thing. It's the history of this stuff in music is very interesting. Like people use payola as like a negative term, but if you really go back and you look at the history of payola, like the original payola scandal in the 50s, like what the music that was being pushed through these backroom deals between record labels and DJs was like Chuck Berry. Like, back then it was the era of segregation. A lot of the black R&B acts that were sort of like incubating the sound of rock and roll, DJs were scared to play them because like, there was a lot of institutional resistance, like, like in the entertainment industry against those artists and the culture that they came out of. So it's like, the DJs like Alan Freed, who was like the guy who coined the phrase rock and roll, he took publishing on a Chuck Berry record in exchange for playing it on his show. He played the shit out of it, and like Chuck Berry is the basis of like certainly the British invasion and most of the mainstream rock that happened in the 60s. The Beach Boys' first single was a rewrite of a Chuck Berry song. The Beatles played a cover of Chuck Berry's Rock and Roll at like every show they did when they were still touring. The Rolling Stones, I think like one of their first singles was a Chuck Berry cover. So it's like it's not that Chuck Berry was like bad and that the payola was like making him an industry plant and like causing him to be bigger than he should have. It's that like the works were all gummed up, and like, you know, people had to do shady shit in order to like get something good through it. So it's like the whatever's going on with Geese, it's like it doesn't necessarily mean that like what they're doing is bad, but at the same time, like the lesson that I kind of took away from it was that I think that like the as far as indie rock bands go, like Geese is probably doing about as well as anybody is. I just think that like even like the biggest possible version of that, which Geese may well be, isn't big enough to like move the algorithm on its own. Like I think that you have to like inflate the presence of it on social media with these fake accounts in order to convince the algorithm that this is worth showing people.
And I don't have a dog in the race. I've never heard a note from Geese. I kind of like to joke that I'm a 30-something-year-old boomer because I basically like mostly listen to stuff from like the 60s to the 90s, you know, kind of all genres, but I just don't keep up with stuff. But I mean, I think that's an interesting conversation more broadly, since I mean, of course, you have one end of the spectrum when you're talking about Chuck Berry, but there's like, you know, 60, 70 years between those two. And I think there has been a lot of examples of record companies putting their thumb on the scale just to like push a product. Because to me, I mean, and this is, I guess, just playing devil's advocate, since the other example that makes me think of, shout out to, you know, friend of the show, Monia Anli, who writes The Fandom Exile, because she wrote an article that wrote about Charlie XCX having this big stadium tour that failed to sell out. And I wonder if it's a similar dynamic there where like it's like the online hype doesn't connect to reality. And as far as like, you know, is pop music, does it represent being popular, or is it just an aesthetic, like a genre preference, like heavy metal or R&B now? And I guess more broadly is like, is this just, you know, moving away from Geese specifically, because that's contentious, and again, I don't have a dog in it, I've never heard them, but is that just what promotion looks like in the digital, like, social media era?
I think that it sort of is what it looks like, because I don't. So one of the underlying kind of ideas that I have, like, you know, you asked earlier what my position on all this stuff is, and zoomed out, I think like one of my core kind of beliefs that underpins everything is I believe that the devaluation of recordings, and we can all kind of like see that records are going down in value, that we spend less on them than we used to. If especially when you look at you adjust for inflation what a CD cost in the 90s, like an album cost in the 90s, versus like what we spend on streaming now. And certainly, you know, like what we were paying for downloads on iTunes, like in the aughts, you know, like records used to cost way more than they do. If you go back and you look at the 50s and you look at like stereo LPs, like in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, like what they cost when adjusted for inflation, those are like premium items. Like back then, like, you know, we're paying for an album what we would pay for like a AAA video game now. And you know, like that's not what we think of as an album costing now. You go on Bandcamp and you pay for an album, you're going to pay like $8, which is like a fraction of what, you know, $3.99 was in the 60s. So if you zoom out, like the devaluation of recordings has been happening since the very beginning. Like people like to blame it on streaming, or people like to blame it on piracy, or they like to blame it on iTunes. I think it's been going on from the beginning, which means that like what is devaluing it is the erosion of scarcity. I think that the more records there are, the less special any single one of them is. And I think that we can all intuitively feel that because of the fact that we're paying for them. Like we're making decisions like in our guts, like about whether or not this stuff is like worth like our hard-earned money. And even if we're not cerebrally thinking like, oh yeah, music is worth less to me personally now than it was, or like this new music is worth less to me personally than old music that was more expensive to produce. Like, I don't think very many people think about it that way, but I think that like everybody kind of feels that way, like on some level. I think that there's like a level in which we can intuitively tell that like records are worth less the more of them that there are. So I think that the 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 new stuff, like like the situation that Geese is in, or Charlie XCX is in, or whatever, like like the records are just not moving the needle as much as they used to. Like the records are not like as central in culture. And so to address your earlier question, like is that just what promotion looks like right now? Like I think like yeah, and I think the reason for that is that like the records are not a big enough deal unless you like inflate them with like the fake metrics to compete against video games and Twitch streamers and Substacks and politics and like whatever else is dominating mind share in the media, or all the other apps that are like on the people's phones jockeying for their attention. Like I think like music used to be, like records more specifically, used to be more central, used to be more valuable, used to be more important to people, and now they are competing with all these other things. And I think that like without some kind of external energy of some kind, like getting in there and juicing it up, like the records are just not enough to like get people excited versus everything else they could be paying attention to.
Yeah, well, I think you spoke to it very well. There was a time I again like I joke that I'm like, I'm a 34-year-old boomer because I basically believe that as an art form, pop music kind of peaked somewhere between the late 60s and mid 80s, not even necessarily in quality, because that's subjective, right? Somebody might think today is the best time ever, the late 90s, whatever. But if you're looking at recorded music as a medium, like kind of like you said, the fact that people were consuming it mindfully, it was kind of this. I often like to say, at least to me personally, I think like probably the mid 70s was kind of the height of recording technology, in the sense that it was advanced enough that you could do really interesting things, but not so democratized that anybody could do it in their garage or their computer room, in my case. And I think that again, as the democratization is a good thing in a lot of ways, I think that just as they say, the medium is the message. It created a specific way that people would consume music, either on an album, mindfully actually listening to it, listening to it in a car, what have you, concert culture, etc. But that having been said, I think maybe that's why newer music is having a harder time competing, because, like you said, there's just so much to compete with outside of music. And it seems like, and maybe this is, again, not to be a 34-year-old boomer, but it seems like younger kids, music is not as important to them, or it's important in a different way. It's like very rarely just like sit down and listen to it. Since I grew up, I'm a little bit younger than you, but not by much. And I grew up in like the tail end of the CD era. Like MP3 players became a thing about halfway through when I was in high school. So I actually had, physical CDs, and even to have a physical piece of media that you're listening to, or even like, you can only have 500 songs in an iPod. I think that changes the way that you will consume music. And for better or for worse, I'm not a 34-year-old boomer in the sense that like, oh, kids these days, they're listening to their video games and whatnot. But like, it doesn't seem like music or like big artists mean the same to them as it did not that long ago. And that's not a value judgment. It's a different way of interacting with the medium.
Yeah, I mean, Bowie infamously said once that music is going to be like a utility one day, and I think that is the relationship that a lot of people have with it now. There have been stories about how white noise outperforms a lot of music on Spotify. And it's a really good example of that. It's just the sound or lo-fi chill hop beats that people study to. People don't care who makes that music. They just put it on and, they get some kind of sensory benefit out of it. And, like there's competition from outside music, but there's also competition from inside music, because when we shifted from physical to streaming, one of the knock-on effects of that was that new music now has to compete with like all the music that's ever been released. And so the kids that are really into music, they are often like, how do you, from the perspective of one of those kids, like if you're getting into everything for the first time, like like you can hear that the new stuff is not as good as like the curated best stuff of every other decade that's ever happened. Like it's not that like they can just skip past like like Candlebox or whatever to get right to the the hot shit. Like they're not listening through like Stabbing Westward and Gravity Kills to get to the Nine Inch Nails record the way that like people in my generation did.
Or Bowie's first couple of shitty albums before he started doing good stuff. For example, you can just start with Space. Don't even start with Space Odyssey, honestly. It's not even that good of an album outside of the single, in my opinion, but not to get too controversial.
Well, yeah, I mean, like, in previous eras, it was like, something whispered about in forums and stuff like, oh, yeah, you got to go get the Berlin trilogy. And like, like a kid that's starting out now, like that's what they start with. Like, like they're probably going to like have been listening to Bowie for years before they ever come across like anything from those first two albums. So it's like new music is competing with that stuff. Like, like the new music Geese is competing with the Smashing Pumpkins, and competing with the Smashing Pumpkins, like such a vast catalog with so much fascinating stuff in it, like that's no mean feat. So it's like the competition has become incredibly fierce, and I think that the competition in previous eras was less fierce because like it hadn't been democratized. Like like you kind of had to pass through like a lot of specialized bottlenecks just to get in the game. And also like one of my pet interests is the extent to which like these other countries where there's the grants and the public media monopolies, like when people talk about the bands that Pitchfork blew up in the aughts, like Broken Social Scene, the Arcade Fire, those are both bands from the Toronto Montreal corridor. And in Canada, like it's kind of a known thing that like bands from that place and those scenes just have had a total monopoly on grants funding. Like like it was all network based, and so those people had so much government backing behind them, like before anybody in the States like had heard of them one way or the other, and certainly before Pitchfork ever cared. So it's like, people are like, oh yeah, Pitchfork broke those bands, like Pitchfork broke the Arcade Fire. It's just like, is that really true? Like if the government was like giving them money to tour and make records like before Pitchfork had ever heard of them, like it's like it's an interesting question. But like, I mean, things have become much more competitive. Things have been much more competitive generally. And, like that's good for some types of music. It's good for other types of music. And we may be getting to the point where it's just kind of like corrosive to music generally. Like, just like the amount of competition is preventing, like, the things that people liked about previous eras from happening, because like the economic incentives sort of override the impulse to do different sorts of things.
Yeah, and I think that's probably a good segue into something I wanted to put a pin in from earlier that you've written about. I think is just in general an interesting topic about like Poptimism as a movement versus quote unquote rockism, the degree to which either of these things exist, and they're just ways people use to argue with each other on the internet, and like the degree to which critics actually have any sway. And I think like a good entry point to talk about this is, and you wrote about this obliquely in your article, I think it was, the greatest living American songwriter we don't talk about, which maybe we can get into that specifically. But you, as a framing device, you talked about the recent, perhaps equally contentious, like the greatest living American songwriters. And of course, as these things always do, they generate a lot of discourse. And I think I didn't read it because I don't, A, I don't have a New York Times subscription, but B, I kind of knew what it was going to be. And again, if you're talking about like what Pitchfork was, say in the early 2010s, when I was really starting to get into quote unquote indie music and being bands, and you know how it was all like, you know, bands from Toronto or Portland that nobody had ever heard of until they were in iPhone commercials versus it's all being like top 40s hip hop now. And the conversation of Poptimism is like, is it a more populist movement? Is it reactionary against quote unquote rockism? Um, and to me, the most interesting thing, because I ended up reading the list and listening to a podcast from the people who did it in preparation of this interview. And there was a moment that I thought was very telling. And I saw, because it was aggregated through Rick Beato, who is an interesting guy in and of himself, if you know him. But there was this one, there was, and maybe we can get into Rick because I have a lot to say about Rick. But I bring this up not because this is not a culture wars slot podcast, but I went into it with a very open mind. And I remember seeing like the guy, I forget his name. It rhymed with harmonica is all I remember.
Yeah, Carmonica.
Because I remember he's like, okay, people had felt ways about this, and you know, it was people maybe had a very specific idea of a songwriter, and I thought people were being very uncharitable to this podcast and the list the way they were talking about it. Because you mentioned Bowie, and I thought, you know, yeah, I think there is a very limited way that people think about songwriting of beginning to end. I wrote verse, chords, bridge, melody, etc. But somebody like David Bowie was an incredibly limited musician, for example. There's a great interview with Nile Rodgers when he's talking about how they wrote Let's Dance Together, or Michael Jackson being not a musician at all, and he like sang the riff of Beat It to Toto, who recorded it. Not everybody knows that. It was Eddie Van Halen only did the solo, which you probably obviously know. But in any case, I'm rambling a little bit. But the point being, like, songwriting being a lot more holistic. And then he just said, well, you know, they think it's just this, you know, white man in a room with a guitar who's having feelings. And I was like, oh, wow, you're going a really hard culture war angle with this. And like, you could have phrased it maybe kind of like I was, like, okay, it's more holistic. You don't even necessarily need to be able to play an instrument to write a song, but it just felt like a very reactionary culture thing to me, at least in that context. So I was wondering what your thoughts are more broadly on that as a topic.
Well, I think that you know, like I think where John was probably coming from, you know, with that, like it's very interesting, like how much people have been talking about this. But the New York Times music desk, especially you know, John Carmonica, Joe Coscarelli, there were definitely two of those guys in the podcast. Like, I really admire them as critics because I feel that they pay attention to what's going on outside of the critical discourse. Like, I think that, you know, like something that I feel as somebody who likes to read a lot about this stuff is that until recently, a lot of the most popular music would go completely unremarked upon at all. There would be like a lot of discourse about stuff that not even necessarily, you know, like I think people romanticize, like, you know, they think that it was all underground, like indie rock bands or whatever. But really, like, you know, like the era where Pitchfork, for example, wasn't you know, reviewing a lot of pop music. Like, I remember, like, in 2012, I was having a conversation with Ryan Schreiber, the founder of Pitchfork, and I was like, you know, you should review Taylor Swift. You should give Taylor Swift a good review, because like I was like listening to Taylor Swift a lot in 2012, and like he was like, no, like absolutely not. Like, I'm not going to do that. And during that time, like when they weren't, like, you know, covering as much top 40 stuff, like it's not as though they were like covering like exclusively like challenging or subversive or like countercultural music. They were covering a lot of stuff that, like, you know, publicists pitched to them, that like a certain group of prestige labels and boutique PR shops like had pitched to them. And those publicists like were almost like the main kind of A&R organ of that entire ecosystem. And they weren't, like, you know, motivated by like fealty to rock or fealty to scenes or fealty to any different type of ethics. Like, they are just small business owners themselves that were just like in the business of marketing prestige. So a lot of that music that would get, like, you know, very analyzed and very discoursed, like, just did not merit it at all. and a lot of music that, especially, from the perspective of the New York Times or something like that, like a lot of music that really was being listened to by a lot of people and was having like a big wider cultural impact, like critics just like weren't interested in taking it seriously or talking about it at all, even to say that it sucks. And I feel that Carmonica and Coscarelli and the New York Times music team, like I think that they sometimes might have like a little bit of a chip on their shoulder about like how
Mhm.
like they try to put themselves in the position of, like if rap is what's big, and for a good part of the 2010s, like on streaming, like rap and Latin music really was like the highest performing stuff in the entire world, or now country. Like most critics, like most people that enjoy consuming, music writing or producing it, don't care very much about country music, but it's like gigantic. Like, there have been like a million different discourses in the past few months about, like rock is back, like the idea that is rock back, like, like, or does this mean that rock is back? And like, really, like what's big on the charts is country. It's just, that's so much less interesting to talk about. And the New York Times guys, like they talk about it, like, like they try to engage with it in
Mhm.
good faith. And, like oftentimes like other people that like, whether readers or other critics, like don't seem to get it. And I feel like this is kind of like an example of that, where it's like, it's true that John probably didn't need to frame it in a culture wars way by being like, people think that songwriting is just a white guy alone in a room with his feelings. But like, I do sort of get where like the chip on his shoulder comes from, where like, he might have this frustration with like how much of the music that does fit that description, or the music that's being pushed by these boutique indie labels and PR shops, has been like so overanalyzed, whereas like,
Sure.
like rap and country, historically hasn't been.
Sure. And like, do we really need another Beatles biopic or whatever? But and I get what you're coming from for sure. And I say this again as like somebody largely without a dog in the fight, so to speak, more just kind of observing it. Since cards on the table, like for me, I it's kind of, I also think about like if you're trying to be more populist and try to reflect what people are listening to, I also think that like the people who read music reviews are probably in a minority. Like I think I probably read a dozen actual album reviews in my life. I'll just be like, on forums talking about it with other random people. Um, so I do think where it's getting from, I think it was expressed in that particular gentleman, maybe in a little bit of an inartful way that I almost wonder, like, are they also playing in the game? Are they trying to like get a Rick Beato type to respond so they can get the content mill going? Which because because again, like what is like what is organically popular versus what the quote unquote the critics like, and because again, looking kind of in preparation for this interview, if we're talking about poptimism more broadly, and maybe if you want to define it a little bit better, since you're do a lot of this stuff for a living, if you want to, do you want to jump into that, and then I'll do my little piece. How do you see it? Because to me, it's just like a reaction against what people thought of like stodgy critics who just wanted to talk about the Beatles and Pink Floyd over and over again ad nauseum, and try to bring things that are organically popular with people, and have that same critical lens. Like that's the most charitable version of it.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, when I think about poptimism, like where my mind immediately goes, like a lot of people, they will go back to an article that was written by the New York Times critic at the time, Khalef Hasana, called "The Rap Against Rockism," that sort of tried to adapt like the old UK Rockism meme for the American audience. I think that was in 2003, 2004, where he published that. But that's not what I think caused the big poptimism backlash to me. I think that like for me, like ground zero is really this controversy that erupted around Stephen Merritt, the guy from the Magnetic Fields, when he was giving a talk about songwriting, and he said that somebody asked him if he had any rap on his iPod, and he was like, no, I don't have any rap or R&B, like contemporary rap or R&B on my iPod. Like he listens to old music. He listens to old music, like, you know, predominantly like from before that shift towards electric amplification and small bands that we were talking about earlier.
Mhm.
Like, you know, he's just somebody who was not listening to a lot of digital stuff. And
An
so
old soul, you'd probably say.
yeah, yeah.
From what I've listened of the Magnetic Fields, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he's very like interested in that era of what songwriting was like back in the sheet music era. You know, like when it was professional songwriters in Tin Pan Alley that were making all the hits, like before it pivoted towards singer-songwriters that were coming out of rural areas and cultures. So what happened was there were a couple of critics, you know, Sacha Farrow Jones was one of them, who kind of like intimated that there was something racist about his lack of interest in this music. There were people who wrote about how, you know, like how even the fact that he doesn't like stuff like the music Justin Timberlake was doing at the time, which was very like, you know, influenced by contemporary rap and R&B, that if there's none of that stuff that you're excited about, that, you know, maybe that means you're racist. And I think like that idea that your consumption, your listening habits correlate to your values and what kind of person you are and whether or not you're racist. I think like that idea getting taken as seriously as it did, like in the discourse at the time, like that idea appearing like in the pages of major media publications, not the New York Times, but others, you know, the New Yorker and other, you know, various online publications. I think like that's like really like what started pissing people off. And I feel like, you know, when people complain about Poptimism, like that's almost what I feel like is at the heart of it, where people that do like rock music or people that do, you know, like music from before the shift to digital, like, you know, like the idea that like that makes them a bad person somehow, or that means they're prejudiced in
Yeah.
some kind of deeper human way. I think that's like a really upsetting idea. And I think that like the work of kind of making amends for that and getting to the bottom of it and processing it, like, you know, was never really done. And so I think there was like a breach in trust that happened that was never really repaired, and it caused like a lot of people to just become like suspicious on a base level of all the writing about pop and rap that came
Sure.
afterwards.
And I would agree, and I think that's kind of a maybe an era that is thankfully being left behind, hopefully. But I think across the board that was maybe, and I think that's an important conversation to have, by the way. I don't think it's not totally without merit. Probably, I can't remember his name, the gentleman from the Magnetic Fields. That seems a little bit uncharitable in his case. But broadly speaking, I think that's a moment in culture that had its I see why people went for it. I see why in some cases it was used cynically. But like I said, this is not a culture war slop podcast, but I do think we have to kind of, like you said, acknowledge that cultural context that exists. Sometimes what does bother me about it, well, it does somewhat intersect with that. But like, you know, for example, one of my favorite bands of all time is the Cardigans, you know, Love Fool, great song, great band.
Great record.
Great record. Great. They do a lot of great records in general. They're still doing great records, but it feels to me like Poptimism is very uneven in its reevaluations. And, you know, just because I remember listening to the criteria that these ladies and gentlemen that were going through for the New York Times bestsellers list. This is not a band that I personally like, but based on their criteria, like, you know, like the guys from Linkin Park should have been in there maybe because they are very transformative. They went probably, I think they were like one of the best, if not the best selling acts of the 2000s.
You would run into a problem there with the criteria of living.
Well, other than the singer, the rest of them are fine. Like I think they all, but my point being that like, it's, like John Bon Jovi, let's say John Bon Jovi, for example, or, you know, even there's you know, any other examples who it's not even like a race or gender thing. Like it seems also very like, you know, who's getting that critical reevaluation. Like you mentioned how big new metal was. Just if you're going based on sales, like new metal's not getting a critical reevaluation in the same way from what I've seen. And that kind of leads me to the other thing I was going to talk about is it feels like it doesn't necessarily sound like this is your opinion, so I'm not accusing you of it, but some of the Poptimists I see, it feels like they're kind of like what I was saying earlier, like how much of a influence do these critics have? And B, like I looked into, for example, like the 10 best-selling rock bands of all time, and out of the 15 top 15 best-selling rock bands of all time, and of those 15 best-selling rock bands, only like Nirvana, Pink Floyd, and the Beatles were not critically savaged. So it just feels to me it's kind of uneven in a way that like it doesn't even necessarily track to culture wars. It just feels like a different set of people's kind of idiosyncratic taste at times.
Yeah, I remember watching a documentary once about Depeche Mode where they talked about, like with real pain on their faces and in their voices, like about how the critics didn't like them when they were first starting out. Like, I feel like most of those behind the music type stories that you were talking about earlier, like a good, probably majority of them probably include like a segment about how the critics hated, like whichever band. Like, so I think like, yeah, like that was one of the points that I was trying to make in the story of Rockism, is that like these days it's kind of hard to imagine or remember in some cases how influential broadcast media was, like radio, television, like MTV, Top of the Pops, radio DJs, like that was like where the real support and curation and exposure was coming from. The critics was just sort of like this little side thing, like much more about like, like people who want to read about music. Like as you said, it's a niche, like it's its own little thing. But after radio sort of became culturally and curatorial impotent in the United States, after the Telecommunications Act of 1996 like enabled all the stations to be bought by a few small or a handful of companies, the sort of bottom up like regional programming that allowed stuff from outside of the core of the industry to become successful. An example that I often use is that song "Whoop There It Is" by Tag Team in
Oh
the
yeah.
90s. Like that came up through the strip club culture, like in Atlanta or in Georgia, and it became a hit like there in that context. Then it went to radio, then it went to a local label, and then it went to the majors, and then it went global from there. That's how a lot of music used to work. And like, you had all these local regional scenes that were tied into local venues, local radio stations, and like that was a step in the ladder to mainstream exposure. And once that was ended, like, then the Telecom Act of 1996 was a big step there. Then it kind of went over to the internet. Like, there was a brief period around the turn of the millennium where MTV became very influential because radio was taking its marching orders from them, and it was very centralized to like MTV's programming decisions became what everybody was playing. But then it went to the internet, and there was this brief period of time where like radio had gone away, MTV had stopped playing videos, we all had iPods, and so like the big curatorial organs that were deciding who was going and who wasn't were, as you mentioned earlier, iPod commercials. That was kind of the biggest one in a lot of
That
ways.
fucking Feist song, man, that is imprinted into my head, into
Oh
my
yeah.
cerebral cortex.
Yeah, and I mean that's coming out of that same Toronto to Montreal scene. So it's like like people give Pitchfork a lot of credit for breaking that stuff, but it's like like Apple and the Canadian government played at least as big of a role. Yeah, like like one of the biggest critical artists of the past few years, like Pitchfork really likes her, is Caroline Polachek. Like I had a song with her on the expanded version of her last album. She used to be in a band called Chairlift, and Chairlift, like back in 2008 or 2009, like they had an Apple commercial, or an iPod commercial. So we're still, even now, like like feeling the ripple effects of how much impact Apple used to have back when they were like paying for songs by real bands to be in their commercials instead of just getting ready-made stuff from like companies that make music especially for commercials. So it's like people can't remember like how big radio was, and people can't remember like how big TV was, like, so, but people do remember like this idea that like Pitchfork and blogs were really big during that weird blip where they had an outsized presence. And so people think that that's like how it always worked, but like it didn't. Like it's like the end of radio was really like the point of rupture, and like the idea of the critic as a platform that breaks new artists, like that's not really what they're for. It's if you think about it, like getting music directly in front of people in a linear feed on a radio station is a much more effective way of promoting that music than talking about it or like, you know, writing up a description of it. So I feel like oftentimes this discussion, you know, gets really skewed by this idea that critics have this responsibility to like use their power to shape the culture, like, you know, like responsibly. But really, like, you know, that's not what they're supposed to do. I think they're supposed to just like try to write stuff that people are going to get something out of, whether it entertains them or teaches them something.
Yeah, I think there is sometimes a little bit of a self-seriousness that comes with it that well, I guess I understand why though, because I mean that's kind of what I was alluding to earlier, that I think it's a lot of like people's self-perception of themselves comes from their media consumption, their taste. Like I feel like there's a how do I want to put this? Um when I see somebody like, you know, I was mentioning Rick Beato. He's somebody who I really like Rick Beato when he talks about things that he likes, not so much when he's the proverbial old man yelling at cloud. Let's put it that way. But I do think that he represents that kind of, you know, jilted, old, not even always rock music fan, because he does a lot of other genres that he will do deep dives on as well. I think like these people will become like avatars of a certain taste. I'm sure you know some like Anthony Fantano. Like I used to watch his stuff a lot in the 2010s, and I just kind of fell out of like watching YouTube all the time. And again, I saw the same thing of him being like all, you know, reviewing like obscure indie stuff, and now it's all top 40s hip hop. And somebody like, I don't know if you know Todd in the Shadows, has kind of gone a similar trajectory where he's somebody I used to really like, and his they got kind of like progressively more angry, which I didn't love. But he's somebody who clearly is like really passionate about music, and I think the stories we can tell ourselves and how we engage with music is a part of it, because it's never just the music, right? It's how we engage with it. Like you know, I promise this is the last time I'll talk about Smashing Pumpkins, but like, you know, they're one of my favorite bands, because like the first time I heard, I think it was the song Today, I was like 16 years old. I'd smoked pot for like the first or second time, and I heard it on like VH1, and it was like, I was a big, you know, heavy metal kid at the time. Otherwise I heard like, you know, whatever classic rock or R&B that my parents liked. And that was like the first time I'd ever heard anything like that. And I keep up with the Smashing Pumpkins, but I'm never going to like anything that I liked. I'm never going to like anything the Smashing Pumpkins do as much as the Siamese Dream album, because nothing is ever going to sound as good to me as hearing that song sounded when I was 16 years old, smoking pot for the first time, hanging out with my friend. And it was a warm summer day. You know, I think everybody has these self-conceptions of music. And I think that's why, because it's, you know, a part of our identity, why people will be so invested in it like that. And like overly, like these critics, and, you know, we will maybe give them more credit, no pun intended, than they're due because of that.
Yeah, there's this book, you know, it's, in my opinion, it's my favorite book that anybody's ever written about music, that anybody probably ever will write about music. It's called The Manual, How to Have a Number One the Easy Way, by a duo called the KLF. They wrote it after they had a novelty dance hit in the UK that went to number one, and they wrote it like as a manual, like that you're a set of directions you're supposed to follow if you want to also, you know, make a number one.
Mhm.
And they talk a lot in it about like the nature of like what pop music is, like what it's for, like in because it's like supposed to be an instruction manual, they do it in, you know, like very like kind of practical terms. And so they talk about how like it's a filing system like for our memory banks, that like, you know, like certain recordings, melodies, like what have you, they get tied up with our memories in exactly the way that you're talking about with the Smashing Pumpkins song, and that's like really where the value of it comes from. And I think that like in this era, like the last 100 years or so, like when we've had recordings, when it's recordings that you know, like our memory banks are getting tied up in, I think that we had a tendency to kind of like overvalue or over revere like the people responsible for those records, or who we perceive to be responsible for those records, like, you know, this Clapton is God stuff that you would see in the 60s, like, you know, the all the permutations of it that went on. You know, when I was a teenager, I was like, you know, like, oh, Trent Reznor is God, or, you know, like, you know, Smashing Pumpkins is God or whatever. Like, you know, I think like now that the recordings are much less valued, they're competing with all these other things. It's sort of an opportunity to recognize that like music is just music. It's just there, you know, like it's nobody owns it. Like technically, legally, like people do, but it's like it doesn't come from within like individuals. It's just something that is like there. It's like the power to like create these melodies that like, you know, can mean something by, you know, getting tied up with a specific memory. Like it's a power that increasingly like belongs to everybody. Like, you know, these people that made these records are not so special. Like they have talent that deserves respect and analysis, but like it's really like, you know, like something kind of like beyond like any individual human's understanding. Like, you know, artists, like they just sort of like tune into it and channel it for a moment. You know, like Bob Dylan talks about how he couldn't write those anything as good as those early songs that he did now. He was just like tapped into something then that he didn't really understand and doesn't understand now, and like, you know, it just happened to work out that way. So it's like critics, like I think they do often have this like self-important attitude. They do often have this high estimation of themselves. Like this stuff that I talk about where I say that like, you know, they were never really as calm down. Sorry, that's my dog.
No problem.
She's having a bad dream or something. Like critics, like they do not like to hear, you know, that they don't have any influence. Like, you know, that era of like perceiving critics as the platform through which new artists get broken, like through which music culture gets shaped. Like they really liked feeling like they had that kind of power. It was part of the appeal for a lot of them, like, you know, that would cause them to go write reviews for Pitchfork, which infamously don't pay very much. And so like, you know, like, yeah, like a lot of critics do have this kind of self-important attitude that can be kind of grating, and it doesn't really, like, in my view, line up with reality. And so I think like it would be healthier for everybody, like on every side of it. Like, you know, I think like art for artists, for the readers, for the writers themselves, like if we all just kind of like let go of like our compulsion to give individuals too much credit for, like, you know, the magical phenomenon of what music is, and, you know, just take a step back and you know, like just all enjoy it together, and you know, like don't let ourselves believe that it comes from within special people only, or that, you know, like that this person's taste, or the way that this person's memories are tied up with this particular person's song are so much more important than anybody else's. Like, you know, like we're all just sharing our own particular perspective. Like, you know, like we all have our own particular relationship with this stuff, and it's all kind of equally valid.
Yeah, I think that's a really beautiful sentiment. And it kind of makes me think it's almost like a weirdly like technologically mediated return to kind of like the historical constant of how music would have been consumed as like just ambiently like folk music, not in like the Bob Dylan sense, but how people will consume music just as a part of the background of the ambient culture. I remember Jack White once saying like how he loved that the Seven Nation Army riff has it became like a soccer chant thing in like South America, just because it's so ubiquitous that it transcends him, that song, the band. It's just like, it's like Smoke on the Water or something like that. You probably even beyond that, it's just something that, you know, people will pick up a guitar and play because it's like, I'm surprised nobody wrote Seven Nation Army earlier, because it's just such an obvious fucking thing to play on guitar, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I went to go see a concert in the like 2008. It was like Kanye West, Rihanna, NERD, which is Pharrell Williams' project, and Lupe Fiasco. And NERD, like they just launched into the Seven Nation Army riff at one point. Didn't even like play the whole song. Like, you know, they just started playing the riff, and everybody just started in the stadium was just like bouncing up and down and like, you know, like just embracing it. Like, you know, like they don't care where it
Probably
came.
probably like the last really big memorable rock riff, I would say, that's like
Yeah, probably.
that
Yeah.
is permeated the culture beyond fans of the genre or their band, that like Smoke on the Water or Iron Man, that like, even if you don't know Deep Purple or Black Sabbath, you know that riff even if you don't know what band it belongs to. I think it's just like what every kid picking up guitar will. It's, again, it's those things, like it's just such an I don't even mean that punitively, it's just such an obvious da da da. It's like a, you know, whole step, half step thing.
Yeah, and I mean, it's like it's not complicated. Like it didn't necessarily take like, you know, like like it's the type of thing where somebody else could have feasibly figured it out at some point, and it would have been just as enjoyable had somebody else done it. And like, you know, like ultimately that's music. Like what I was talking about with the you know, how recordings like sort of become less valuable the more of them there are. There's kind of a finite territory, like, you know, that can be covered. Like there's only so many different combinations of
Mhm.
chords and melodies and words that can be created, and a lot of them have been made already, and now we've got like the AI generation where you can just like generate them at a push of a button. So the amount of new ones that is going to spill out into the marketplace is going to like get exponentially bigger. So, you know, like yeah, like I think what you said about how it's a weird technologically mediated return to what music was before. I think that's exactly right. I think you know, maybe it was McLuhan, like, you know, one of those like, you know, Catholic sort of guys said something to the effect of the digital retrieves the medieval. Like the
Ooh.
and I think that's like 100% what's happening with music. Like the digital, like as music becomes more digital and more of the skills that are necessary to create recordings become automated. And at this point, like the automation is pretty fucking good. Like
Mhm.
the what it does ultimately kind of do is retrieve, you know, that role that music used to play in life before, just in a slightly new way.
Yeah, and I think that that segues well into another topic that I wanted to bring up to you, because I think music, like you wrote about music, how the technology evolving both changes the type of artists that become popular, as well as um, like the how people engage with it. And I wonder, like, because I've been also, you kind of alluded to it, like people you know, talking about the return of rock music, or how country is really becoming popular now. um and there, it seems to be, and I think I feel in some ways like people mean, when at least the impression that I get from it, in my maybe limited perception, is it's not even necessarily rock as a genre, but it's more of like moving away from that hyper produced, you know, Swedish pop music producer, the dream, etc., and to something a little bit more holistic and natural feeling, whether or not that's, you know, a myth as well, putting that aside, to like an acoustic guitar or a piano or whatever genre it's going to be. um and I'm interested to see how that's going to develop, if it's going to bifurcate of people just wanting to not be online and wanting to have live music again, and it'll loop back around to people going to dance halls, because I've read a number of think pieces about that. Or if like the AI thing is just really going to take off, and like, you know, Gen Z, like, you know, older folks are very biased against it. It seems like the younger people get, like Gen Z is not as upset about AI or auto tune, what have you, or just like Gen Alpha is like, everybody, it'll be, Hatsune Miku basically. So what do you think? Is that going to bifurcate, or are we going to see some combination thereof? Because one more thing, and I'll throw it back to you. We talked about it at the beginning of the conversation. Like, I have, a couple of guitars, a couple of amps, some drum software, a bass. By myself for a couple $100s, I can make rock band recordings that rival the quality of 90% of recorded rock music. Not because I'm such a great and talented musician, but because of the way that technology has been democratized. And I wonder if that is going to play a factor now, because it used to be very expensive to record live music. Now one person can do it very competently.
Yeah, I think that, to some extent, we're seeing that, we've been seeing that really since 2020. The Taylor Swift album that came out in 2020, Folklore, it was a retreat away from digital production, like toward sonics that were, like more organic and crunchy and granola, like still, it's not necessarily like, like a live band in the studio in one take type of thing, but like, much more of the vibe of singer-songwriter music. And that became like a tremendously influential record. Like there's so many big pop records that have come out since then that have been like, copying that record's homework. And even, something like Sabrina Carpenter, she had like a big single where the production was just like a royalty-free loop that was like, purchased from one of these websites like Splice that just offers that type of thing. And they wrote the song on top of it. Like the digital sounds, like the bells and whistles that sort of like typified popular music in the 2010s have totally become deprecated now. They're like, like in thrift stores are full of them, going for pennies on the dollar. And, the songwriting is seen as the valuable thing. But as far as like in the future, like I don't think it's going to continue. Like I don't see a big revival of analog type stuff coming. I don't see a huge return to, we talked about what a blip like the alternative rock movement of the early 90s was. Part of what makes it seem like such a weird blip in retrospect is that it really was like a turn back towards the recording equipment and approach of the 70s and the musicality of 70s rock, like from the very digital kind of thin brittle production that a lot of the mainstream 80s hair metal bands had kind of favored. Like you had like these deeper sounds, like that were being made by these dropped tunings and like this vintage equipment. It was just this fuller, richer sound. And it's sort of weird that like that caught on and it became like a big mainstream thing. And you had like big bands going to Steve Albini, like, to have him produce his record for a little while. But I don't really see that thing happening in the future. Like, do you have Waymos where you are?
Yeah.
Have you ridden in one?
No, not yet.
Something that I've heard from people who live in places where they've got these things, like I used to live in Tempe, Arizona. I lived pretty close to the first Waymo pedestrian death. But what I hear from people in places where they're available is that they actually prefer the Waymo to a regular Uber. I think that like people overestimate, this is something that Jasmine Sun said on a recent Substack post of hers. People overestimate like the value of the human premium. Like I don't think that like,
Interesting.
I don't think that like the human and I wrote about this in I had an article called "Why Do So Many Big Artists Hate Touring," where I talked about all these situations where the most recent example would have been what happened with MIA, who's like like a very controversial person, like who says a lot of things that confuse and upset people. And she did that while she was opening for Kid Cudi on tour, and people got really mad, and she got fired off of the tour. And she went on Twitter to complain about it and said something to the effect of the artist is dead, like it's going to get replaced by robots. And to an extent, I think that's true. I think that like fictional artists, like holograms, like, like digital sort of generative like performers that are capable of doing exactly what the audience wants them to do, like playing the songs the audience wants to hear and looking the way the audience wants them to look. I think that like the audience like at this point would prefer that to like humans. I don't think that
Interesting.
the mass audience is like, really interested in like flawed, like, like human beings who have bad days and like make bad records sometimes, and like who want to do their own thing and don't want to play the songs that the like Radiohead like hates playing Creep. Like, I think that at this point, I remember seeing recently there was this British band called the Blossoms, I think, that did a cover at some festival, a set of Smiths covers with what's his face, the Rick Astley on vocals. So it's like, like people who don't like Morrissey, like they can still enjoy the Smiths music, like in this ethical way. That type of thing, like it would have been anathema in the 90s when authenticity was the coin of the realm. But now I think people care more about entertainment value, consistency, like production value for money. And so I think like now, like, like the authenticity doesn't really matter. Like you could have something like the fictional group from that K-pop Demon Hunters movie, like, playing stadiums and like running Instagram accounts that are operated by chatbots, where you can like DM the fictional pop star and they DM you back. I think that's like where music is going, or at least in the mainstream. And on the smaller levels, like, it's probably not going to go that way necessarily, but like at the smaller levels, like it's almost impossible to tour. It was the margins were getting razor thin even before this Iran shit kicked off and like the gas prices started going up. I'm seeing all kinds of musicians and even like DJs who have the lowest overhead of anybody saying that they can't make money doing it anymore because like plane tickets cost so much and gas costs so much. So it's like, I don't know that like the mechanics are there like to allow like a more holistic, like organic, crunchy, farm to table, like style of music to really succeed at scale. Like it's still going to exist, like it's still going to be there for the elites that like have mind freaked themselves into believing that that's what they want. But as far as mass culture goes, like I think it's much more going to be in the direction of people preferring the Waymos like over the Uber, where they have to like talk to the driver. Like I think that's where society is kind of going.
Interesting. Well, for clarification, I meant like, more like what do they call it? Bedroom pop, where like people kind of more rock in the vein of that, Sabrina Carpenter song. Another one that comes to mind is like Lil Nas X's Old Town Road was from like a free sample of a Nine Inch Nails song originally. But one more thing, I also think like the grunge bands, for at least the early first wave of grunge, I think was notable because also like the songwriting was just really good, whereas the later alternative rock stuff, maybe not so much. But at that point, my question, I think that's a good point. I think there's probably, I could see there being a bifurcation of people who want music written by people. Because I don't know, I'm a little bit more cynical. I don't know if the AI generated stuff is ever gonna get good enough and be cheap enough that it'll get rid, that it's still always going to have that little, like, kind of like when you drink a Diet Coke, like it's almost there, but you can taste that aspartame. But I think that's an interesting way of looking at it. But at that point, like, why bother with live music at all? Why not just experience it in VR? Or like at that point, kind of one more thing, and I'll throw it back to you. Like Kiss is talking about being a hologram band, and I thought they'd like, oh, let's do us in our heyday. They're doing like cartoon versions of themselves, and that seems like the way to go, honestly. Other than the Rolling Stones, who will do it forever.
Yeah, well, I think that, that's going to be the direction that it goes, like cartoon characters. Like VR is, like I think we're a long way off from like VR like becoming like a mass culture thing, because it just doesn't feel very good to have the helmet on your face and
or whatever, not VR specifically, like on your phone. Like my point being, not like you don't need to physically be there at that point. Why not consume it just on your phone or on the computer? Like I don't see the value of the concert. Maybe I'm just totally off base. What's your thoughts?
I think that people are so something that's definitely happened like in the past like 15 years or so is the amount of money that people spend on recordings has gone way down. With streaming subscriptions, like there's free tiers, so you can spend nothing and still have access to like all the music that exists. But concert tickets and the amount of people or money that people spend on ancillary, purchases related to that, hotels, parking, concessions, merch has become like luxury priced in a lot of situations. Like people are spending way, way more on that shit. Like if you look at the what Coachella costs. Calm down, please. The if you look at what people have been spending at Coachella, like in the aughts when it first started versus like, there was a big jump in 2010 when they started booking more mainstream headliners with Jay-Z and going to 2 weekends. And like the prices have just been going up and up ever since. So it's like the music being performed like at these festivals and at these big arena and stadium shows has becoming progressively more pre-recorded, and more the experience is reliant more and more on these big screens and these sort of like pre-made visuals. But people are valuing it more people are going out to them. People are paying more for the privilege of attending. So I think that like the live musicianship is not the draw. I think that the overwhelming sensory experience of just hearing it in a room full of other people, it seems to be something that can survive live musicianship and authenticity being subtracted from the equation. So I think it's going to keep going in that direction. And, I think like the AI is just going to be like one aspect of it where, with the K-pop Demon Hunters, like if that type of thing where it's a fictional pop group, like the songs are probably still going to be made by professionals. Certainly like the performances on record and the production is going to be, very bespoke and very expensive. But, like I think there's all different ways that the AI can be part of that stack where the performances themselves, like, in each city, they'll be a little bit different because the performances can be generated with like, the image and video generators and this type of thing. Like it's similar to what I was talking about with the move from big bands to small bands. The technology enables things to be done faster and more cheaply than they were in the past. That's an economic incentive that is going to shape culture, like just because people are going to want that economic benefit, like even if the audiences aren't necessarily on board with it at first. And in every other situation like that, where even something like autotune, where there was a lot of backlash and skepticism when people first realized it existed, people eventually got on board with it. Like, people don't care so much about that anymore.
Yeah, I guess it'll be interesting to see how it shakes down. Since on one level, I'd be interested because I've heard and read similar things. It doesn't seem to be new artists that people are shelling out for. And again, at that point, like I wonder, like, do the Kiss thing. Why not have the perfect version of the Beatles or Michael Jackson? Because it's been flirted with it, and I think only like artists as big as like Kiss or Michael Jackson can get away with it. But it'll be interesting. And again, that's kind of what I was getting at earlier. It'd be interested to see if there's going to be a holistic mix of like the Gorillaz is a good example of that's Damon Albright, whatever it is, the guy from Blur, but he has this cartoon band. He has that are the characters, and then you have other musicians who participate. And I wonder if we'll see like a blending there of something between totally fictional and like there's some warts and some weirdness, so to speak, but you can augment it with technology. You have a fictional band or a fictional artist, like it kind of like VTubers, if you're aware of that, but music. I'll be interested because it doesn't need to be all like, return to tradition. We're going to go play guitars in dirty clubs again, or K-pop Demon Hunters in front of, 10,000 people. It'll be interesting to see if there's some kind of like combination thereof.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the combination is going to take the shape of like, like you asked if somebody in your position that's got like the home recording equipment, like, the whether or not people like that are going to be competitive in the marketplace. And I think like, yeah, but not necessarily like as artists. Like I think that the skill set of being like the front of a project is kind of like its own thing. Like people don't necessarily care so much now. I think like if the person that they're looking at is the one that played the instruments or wrote the songs, You know, the example that I gave of like people who are not the Smiths, like doing a set of Smith songs at a festival and people enjoying it more than they would probably enjoy seeing Morrissey do it. You know, like that's sort of a good example. So I think like, you know, people who are in your position or my position, like, you know, like people who have the ability to create music, you know, cheaply and effectively, like using home gear, like we're probably going to be working for like, you know, these bigger like Hatsune Miku, like fictional artist type
Mhm.
people, of which there will be a wide variety of them at different levels. Like we're going to be working for them on a work for hire basis where we're not going to own any of it, but we just
Mhm.
sort of like punch in to you know, like do a little bit of work on something for like a pittance, and then like, you know, not be at all part of how it's presented to people. I think that like the specialness and the reverence that like people had for recording artists specifically, it doesn't make sense in a world where recordings are worth so little compared to, you know, other forms of entertainment. So I foresee like, you know, there being all kinds of different opportunities for people to make recordings or recordings to get made, both using the Gen AI tools and not. But I think that like, you know, the idea that anybody that very many people are going to find like the one person using automated processes to make things on their own, like in relative isolation, that people are going to see that as valuable as like the Beatles or, you know, like the bands and the characters that were doing this stuff like during the, you know, the 60s to the 80s era of that you're talking about being such a big fan of. You know, like I think people are going to recognize that those are different things and will always see them as different things and will always value the latter thing less.
Mhm. That makes sense, and I guess I'm open-minded to see where it goes too, since again, I've joked that I'm, you know, a 30-something-year-old boomer, but I also don't like categorical. I'm like, "Ah, I hate anything made after 1990." It's just, you know, it doesn't necessarily grab me in the same. But there's random songs and artists who will grab me. Um, I just maybe a little bit too fixated on my own interest and have my nose in a book or a, you know, older album a lot of the time, so to speak. But it will be interesting. I think maybe still a little bit too early to call. I still I wonder if like that middle grade, you're talking about the political angle earlier, just in the sense of like, you know, a middle grade power like England. Maybe there'll be like middle grade artists like the Gorillas, like a new Gorillas, like where somebody, a group of people, like a collective is like, you know, this is Hatsune Miku, not Hatsune Miku, but you know, this is a character that, you know, people contribute to, and you can have a lore behind it and, you know, a story or whatever. I think it's, to me, I find that very interesting because and maybe this is just my you know, quote unquote rockist prejudices of, it feels less interesting if it's the mega corporation artist, and if there's, you know, some kind of middle ground there, like a middle power. I think there's a lot of potential for using the technology but also still having some of that human flavor, but I guess we'll see.
Yeah, I mean, you know, like the middle powers, the what's interesting about them is that I think like a lot of the music that wasn't like so driven by the economic incentives like was coming out of those countries, and it was because of the government support that those artists and those companies were getting, and that's all disappearing now because you know, like NATO and the post Bretton Woods world order is breaking up. Like the United States is pulling away, they're no longer extending military protection to these countries, so they no longer have as much money to spend on social programs. So that stuff is kind of all going away. So if there is going to be like, you know, like a weird middle ground of stuff, it's going to have to arise from within an ecosystem that's dominated by market forces. So that can still happen. Like, I mean, you know, like a lot of great music has been made because of market forces. Like, you know, like for anybody that is a fan of hip hop, like a lot of the great independent hip hop labels, like, you know, arose in exactly that way that you describe, where it's sort of like a middle thing and a weird mix of talent and ambition that created something like, you know, No Limit Records and Cash Money Records in New Orleans in the late 90s. But it's you know, like I noticed you've got a stormtrooper from Star Wars, you know, like behind you in your little studio setup, and it's like you know, the big corporate, from a musical perspective, like we might all think that we don't like the big corporate brands and the stuff that's
Mhm.
coming out of them, but it's like, you know, like a lot of us probably have like a soft spot for some kind of big corporate
Mhm.
product of or another in some capacity. And especially like as the AI stuff gets better, the opportunities for everybody at the consumer level to participate creatively in those media properties in some way, like, you know, will increase. There would be all kinds of ways where, like, if you have some kind of musical aptitude, like, you know, you might be able to, like, you know, parlay that into some kind of work where you're not really going to get paid and you're not going to get a lot of credit, but you get to feel like you contributed to, you know, some fictional universe that you personally like have some kind of attachment to. And I think that that's going to be like more motivating than, you know, probably
Yeah.
it seems like it would be.
And for the record, like I'm not a despite, kind of how I was being a little bit cheeky, like I'm not a snob. I just like, I like the big mega corporation stuff. Believe it or not, conveniently, pop music actually kind of peaked when I was a young teenager. So Evanescence is actually the best band ever. I don't know if you knew that. No, but jokes aside, I see where you're coming from. And I'll be interested to see how it goes. But I think, excuse me, I think I'm probably taking up enough of your time. I want to know if you have any closing thoughts, and I think we covered a lot of stuff here, but it's been going for a little while.
Not off the top of my head. You know, I love to talk about this stuff and I love to write about it. And
Mhm.
you know, like as you kept kind of saying, like, you know, I often feel like I don't necessarily like have a dog in these conflicts either. My work and, you know, like my passion for this stuff is not really about like advancing one point of view over another. I'm an individual, and so like you know, like especially as a critic, like, you know, I've made it clear how I feel about the influence of critics on music, which is that I don't think it's necessarily very powerful. I don't think that I really get to decide like what type of music succeeds and what doesn't, or what kind of business models succeed and what don't. So I just try to understand what's happening the best I can, and just sort of try to see, like, you know, both the
Mhm.
positive and the negative of it uh as it's happening. Like I think that ultimately, like, this whole situation with recorded music is extremely chaotic. There's like governments involved, there's market forces, there's all these, like, you know, competing interests that, you know, like don't necessarily always fit into neat binaries, like despite how much we all love neat binaries. And so, you know, like I find it very rewarding and interesting to try to puzzle it out. But at the end of the day, like I just kind of want to understand it better. I feel like, to me, like that's sort of what love is. Like I feel like idealizing and simplifying something is not really loving it. I feel like if you really love something, you try to understand it and see it for what it is. And so that's what I try to do with music.
Well, for what it's worth, I think you do an exceptionally good job of that. That's why I invited you on, since like the Poptimism debate can get very slop-esque, let's put it that way.
Sure
Um,
can.
and I try to have people on the podcast who have interesting, thoughtful, nuanced things to say. And I would say, yep, folks, subscribe to Jamie Brooks, the Seed of Loss on Substack. Do you have any plugs or promotions that you want to tell the audience about?
Uh, just stay tuned to the newsletter. You know, like I'm working on a really big project about the impact that AI is going to have on music in the short term. You know, like I'm working very diligently on it. I don't know if it's going to be done by the time this goes up, but you know, keep watching for that if that's a subject that interests you.
Well, I will be sure to read and share, because I think we probably could have talked about particularly the AI and music topic, for another hour or two. But like I said, we're both busy people and have shit to do, presumably. So, Jamie, I really appreciate you coming on the show. This has been a great conversation. So, for all my guests, I always ask like a short little sign-off question to end the show. Um, uh, it may be a little saccharine, but I always ask, what is something that makes you feel hopeful, or something you're excited for the future?
I love I've got a local community radio station that I volunteer at. I host a radio show every other Saturday, and like it's mostly kind of old boomers, like down there. It's a lot of fun. I really love getting to know them and playing music for them and like having them call in. And I think radio generally is, like it's very important to the boomers specifically. Like it was the transistor radio was their iPhone. It was like the dominant consumer electronic device of their day. And like the boomers are, like they're not going to be around too much longer. Like, respect to the boomers, I'm going to miss a lot of them. But like 5 to 10 years from now, there's going to be a lot less of them around than there are now. So it's like radio is somebody's going to inherit it. Like, it's a lot of infrastructure. It's very powerful technology. It's very useful in a way that I think younger people don't necessarily appreciate. And I'm really excited to see what happens when, new people start getting a hold of that. And I'm really hopeful about what might happen when, people come into that world and start realizing how powerful it is.
Well, I think that's a really interesting, unique answer. Well, Jamie, so thank you so much for coming on the show. This has been a great conversation.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
You have a good one.
You too.